Okay, thank you guys all for watching my talk in these strange days. My name is Michael Wells. I'm a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm going to talk about identifying habitat conservation opportunities using region-wide radar interpolation in the Great Lakes Basin. So I'll set the scene today for what we're going to be looking at. The Great Lakes are located in the northeastern United States, and they are a unique ecosystem to many species. Additionally, these lakes are encountered by migrating birds and bats as they travel through their journey from wintering grounds to breeding grounds and back again. These lakes hold a large percentage of the fresh water on Earth, and each lake is unique with varying orientations and characteristics. The Great Lakes Basin itself has a wide variety of landscapes. We have large urban areas, including over 33 million people who are living along the shores of the Great Lakes, and major cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Ontario, as well as large agricultural areas such as parts of Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio, and Indiana. The Great Lakes Basin is also home to large tracts of intact forest being used both as natural areas and for silviculture, and there's heavy coastline use, again, many along these major cities. With all of this population and use around the Great Lakes, there's a really great interest in preserving and enhancing the habitat around those Great Lakes. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative was established in 2009 by an act of Congress to accelerate the restoration of the Great Lakes Basin, and this is being built on the foundations that were started by the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Acts in the 1970s. This program includes funding for toxic substance removal, invasive species control, non-point pollution, restoration of habitat and species, foundations for future restorations, and in our case, stopover habitat modeling. So why is stopover habitat modeling so important? Well, the Great Lakes are not just important for people, but to animals as well. Millions and millions of migrating bats and birds use the Great Lakes area. And when we think of migrating birds, we often think of diurnal migrants like these cedar waxwings, or the hawks you might see on Hawk Ridge, or something like ducks or cranes. But in reality, most migrants are actually nocturnal. Most passerines are migrating at night, and this makes them inherently very difficult to observe. And the Great Lakes may be acting as an obstacle, so we don't know how animals are reacting when they're encountering the Great Lakes. Some possibilities they could be crossing them, they could be going around. A lot of these smaller migrants, especially passerines, cannot land on the water, so they need to be able to cross these lakes before dawn breaks when they're either tired or vulnerable to predators. And so this airspace in the Great Lakes is crucial habitat. And habitat is often thought of as forests or wetlands where an animal feeds or breeds or lives. But airspace is just as important to birds and bats during the migration. The airspace can provide them with winds to assist in their movements, height for navigating, and a path clear of obstacles so they can fly from their wintering grounds to their breeding grounds at maximum speed. Without these things, they would spend more energy flying between buildings or under treetops that may prevent them from reaching their destination efficiently and survive to reach that destination. A comparison would be taking a trip hundreds of miles and comparing the journey on a highway with that of back roads with tight turns, stoplights, and dirt roads. It's a lot more fuel efficient and quicker to use the highway. So these animals really need to be able to move through that open air to successfully complete their migratory journey. So our goal with the Avian radar project, which was established in 2011, is to help improve our understanding of the airspace and migration in the Great Lakes. We've deployed our radar units all over the Great Lakes and since gathered a ton of site-specific information. We're now taking that information and we're trying to apply it to a large-scale data analysis. We're looking at basin-wide modeling and then subsequently applying that to decision-making for conservation and stopover habitat. So the advantages of using a mobile radar is it allows for nocturnal observations, being able to observe birds while they're migrating actively, and when the majority of birds are migrating actively is really important. It allows us to track individuals at an individual level to observe the behavior. It's autonomous, so we don't have to be there 24/7. It's continuous. We record basically from when we set it up in, say for a fall migration in late August all the way through November. And the data collection is passive, so we build up a lot of data. It's also quite mobile, so we can move them around from place to place and cover more areas in the Great Lakes. And finally, it also has these two antennas, which allows us to capture different slices of the airspace. So the radar beam, one of the antennas covers basically about 2.8 kilometers, or sort of a little less than 2 miles vertically, and then it spreads out to about 2.3 miles, or 3,700 meters horizontally. And these two different antennas gives us very different aspects of what's happening for our migrants. So the vertical radar gives us a much more accurate account of migrant passage. It acts as a gate as the animals fly through it. We can count them, and we're not having them split in and out of the radar beam. It also gives us a really good amount of information on the altitude that these animals are flying at. In contrast, the horizontal gives us really good spatial coverage, as well as really important information on what behaviors these animals are showing. So between these two antennas, we can survey the whole airspace habitat. And so now I just want to walk you through a nighttime, a single night of migration. So this is from our field site in downtown, just north of downtown Chicago, on a place called Montrose Point. And this is 7 p.m. Dusk is in about 10 minutes, so we're just before dusk. And each of these little squiggles, on the left-hand side, you see the direction. So this is our horizontal radar. And each of these squiggles is a bird or a bat, and they're color-coded by direction. So red is south, blue is north, green is east, and purple is west. For those of you who are colorblind, I apologize profusely. I don't have any ability to change these colors. And on the right-hand side, we have our altitude and count. So this is the vertical radar, and each of these long lines is a bird that is flying through these radar. So this is right before dusk. This is the same time just 1 hour later. And I should also mention that these are 15-minute segments, so we're only looking at 15 minutes. All of the migrants are moving through in a 15-minute span. And you can see that there's a big difference. So on the previous slide, you saw that there's a lot of different colors on this directional radar, and you can see that they're suddenly all moving in sort of a westerly or northwesterly position. In addition, you can see that there's a lot more animals that are showing up in this 15-minute span. You can see that they're also filling our altitude up to about 2,000 meters pretty substantially. And I should just point out that there's a couple of artifacts here. This sort of donut shapes on the horizontal are just where the radar beam is switching between different frequencies, and so you get these little dead spots. You also can see that to the west, sort of inland, you seem to have these really big gaps where we're not picking up much. This is because there's a line of tall buildings along the shoreline that's partially blocking our radar beam. So as we go through the night, we see that there's still more animals moving. You can see that the direction has also changed from sort of that western or northwestern movement to a straight north movement again on the left. And you can see those gaps a little bit more clearly. So you can see where we're picking up some migrant activity in the gaps between the buildings, as well as those artifacts being driven by those pulse changes. And on the horizontal radar, you can see that we're still moving a huge number of birds from basically the deck at 0 meters to 2,000 meters. And again, you can see another one of those pulse changes in that arc on the altitude and counts. So as we get to dawn, we see one more shift. So animals are moving suddenly back into shoreline. You can see that animals that are over the lake on the right-hand side of the direction figure have shifted towards the west again. And if you look on the southern side of sort of the southwestern side over the cities, you can see that they're still moving more or less north. This is driven by animals starting to move into shore. And so this is just after dawn, and they're actually coming into land to rest, refuel, and avoid predation. And you can see that also happening on the altitude counts. Not only are we seeing fewer animals, but their altitude has really dropped. It's sort of no longer all the way up to 2,000 meters. It's more in the 500 or lower meters or 1,000 or lower meters. And then when we get back to 12 p.m., so the middle of the day, we see that it kind of shifts back to what we saw right before dusk. So again, you have a lot of animals that are moving. Or there's many fewer animals, and there's many directions that they're moving in. So these are probably gulls or waterfowl moving around locally foraging. And again, you can see that there's some animals moving sort of with their altitude counts, but many fewer. Okay, so this is a map of the areas that, or the sites that we've investigated. The spring are in green diamonds, and the fall are in those red squares. And until the last 2 years or so, we've been working on a site-by-site basis. And over the last 2 years, we've been really integrating all of this data to get a more basin-wide view. And the way that we do that is we're taking our radar data, and we're adding things like land cover data. So this is from the National Land Cover Database. You can see different land covers are color coded in different ways. So those reds are urban areas, and the browns are agricultural or cropland, as well as things like night light. So this is giving us an idea of night light data, as well as some proximities to coastline. And so again, we're combining this with the data that we have on the amount of animals moving through an area. So this is our target passage rate. And when we take this data, what we can do is we can combine it with those other data layers and use a process called empirical Bayesian kringing to build a map. So combined, using something called imperial Bayesian kringing, we get a map that looks something like this. So the colors here provide information both on the passage rate, so how many migrants are moving through, and the uncertainty around that variation. So this is for spring night, and I'm just going to walk you through kind of what some of these colors mean. So in general, the higher areas of passage are going to be have these bluer colors. So as you can see, southern Lake Michigan around the Chicago area has these really blue areas, as well as places like Duluth and around the southern, the southwestern shore of Lake Erie. Lower areas of passage were kind of surprisingly in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and the sort of upper lower peninsula of Michigan. Now, in addition to just the passage rate, we also have the variance around the passage. So we're calculating this using something called the coefficient of variance, and this is calculated as the standard error of the interpolation prediction divided by the total number of passage at each site. So this is catching both the overall rate of movement, and also lower passage areas tend to have a higher variance just because of the way this is calculated. So this basically gives us an idea of what are areas that are really stably useful and that we have high confidence that we have high passage rates, and what are areas that either have lower passage rates or places that we have less confidence in how many migrants are moving through. Okay, so this is the same map, but for the fall migration season. You can see there's a lot of difference here. The lower peninsula of Michigan has a little more higher passage rate than the springtime, although you still see that Chicago is still very important. And we also look at different time periods. So those last two were both nighttime periods. Here is the dawn time period. One of the things that I just want to point out with the dawn time period is you can see that the coastlines, especially on the western shores of Lake Michigan, the areas next to the shore tend to have really high usage compared to some of the inland areas. And this is probably due to migrants moving from over the water onto the coast during the dawn to rest, refuel, and avoid predation. And here we can see the same information for dawn during the fall migration season. And again, you can still see that those shoreline areas really are coming up important. So how does this data help us identify stopover habitat conservation priorities? One of the things that this can do is we can look for changes among seasons and around the the diel cycle. So, how dawn and dusk are being used versus how night is being used. And they give us information on different things. So things like dawn, you can really determine areas where migrants are landing, and at dusk taking off. Whereas at night, you're really getting information about how migrants are using the airspace and how they're traveling over these areas. So dawn and dusk might be more important for things like habitat restoration, where they're actually looking for habitat, and we can predict where they might be landing and focus our areas of restoration in those places. For nocturnal changes, we can do things like make changes to lighting or building practices to prevent bird strikes. So again, some of these urban areas around Chicago would be a good example of being able to leverage that high migration rate to affect change on bird migration survivorship. So we can also, one of the other strengths of this is we can take this data and we can combine it with other data sets to really narrow down and leverage this to find sort of the best areas to do restoration for not just migrant birds, but for other animals. And so in this way, we can do things like combine conservation needs and identify the most cost and resource effective options for conservation and preservation. So I'm going to walk through an example of this that I've been working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's coastal program. And this is just a worked example where a habitat restoration biologist needs to determine some new coastal areas to work with partners on land purchase and conservation projects on Lake Superior. So this restoration biologist is looking for locations that have a wetland or potential wetland restoration opportunities, or in a 100-year floodplain for wetland restoration. And they're looking for habitats that provide potential for restoring both fish and bird habitat. And that seems like kind of a very difficult thing, since fish are using the aerial airspace, birds are using the aerial airspace, and fish are using, aquatic environments. But what we can do is we can sit down and first find places with good wetland restoration potential. So this is a wetland restoration index put together by the Audubon. So this is some data that this biologist can draw from. And the highest wetland potential index is going to be that blue color, and the lowest is the red color. And we can see that there's 6 locations that have some okay restoration index on Lake Superior. So Duluth, going from west to east, Duluth, Bad River, 3 sites sort of associated with Keweenaw Peninsula, and then a site on the eastern end near Whitefish Point. So here we can look at the fall dawn information. So this is giving us information about where birds are trying to land. And we can see that we can eliminate one of the sites. The site on the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula seems to have some of the least heavy use compared to these other sites. And then we can look at the same information from dawn in the spring migration season, and we can eliminate 2 more sites both adjacent to the Keweenaw Peninsula. So here we have the Apostles, Duluth, and that Whitefish site point. So our coastal program officer also really wants to know something about how they can combine bird migration, stopover habitat restoration, and fish restoration. And so we can combine some of our fish data. So that dark orange color that you see are brook trout restoration sites. This is a species of conservation concern for fisheries. The blue and hatched areas are sturgeon restoration priorities, and the black dots are Great Lakes fish spawning location. And we can see that these fish spawning areas really don't provide a whole lot of information. So we have to look at some more ways to bring it down. So one last thing we can look at is the coastal program has one of its species of conservation concern is common terns. And we can use eBird data, so these yellow points, as well as some colonial waterbird survey data, which are the orange points, to determine some of the best areas for restoration there. And we can eliminate that Whitefish Point site and sort of focus on these last 2 areas, one near the Apostle Islands and one near Duluth. Okay, so we're down to just these 2 sites, and one last thing we can do is look at our nighttime movement. So sort of what are these areas being used overall for airspace. And we can see that the Duluth area actually has a little bit more use than the Apostle Islands. And so this way, this shows that the Duluth wetlands may be the best location from the criteria that our coastal program biologist is using to sort of put the resources into and move forward with that particular site. And maybe the Apostle Islands and Whitefish Point might be alternate sites. But in this way, we can use these data sets to really combine a bunch of different really important conservation priorities and figure out ways in which to leverage all of our data to make the best choices on conservation. Okay, so this Great Lakes Decision Support Tool, or Great Lakes Airspace Map, the GLAM tool, is being used to bring together site-specific data across the Great Lakes that this project has gathered. So we're trying to take 8 years of data that we've been collecting and actually bring a full basin perspective. And we're really hoping that this data is going to be useful to inform land managers and other conservationists about areas where migrants are concentrating, areas where their airspace is particularly in use. And hopefully combining this with other resources will allow us to better allocate conservation resources, personnel, and efforts to really have the most effect on migrating birds and bats. And the public release of these maps is imminent. We're undergoing some final evaluations within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So check at our website, www.fws.gov/radar, for updates on when this is going to go live, and some other products we've done, including seasonal reports for radar sites. The radar data set is publicly available there as well, and then we're also producing some journal articles, including some work on dawn orientation at the shoreline, and then there's another article in review right now looking at sort of basin-wide directional movement with our radar data. So with that, I'd like to thank the rest of the radar team, Elizabeth Rigby and Kevin Heist, as well as, not pictured, Jennifer White, who started right before the pandemics, and I just don't have a picture of her. And again, the Fish and Wildlife Radar team. So I'm looking forward to any questions you guys might have on Saturday. Thank you.